Okay, Mr. Mayor, you're live.
Thank you very much, Mr. Budd. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Audit Committee meeting. Due to COVID-19 and recommendations by Waterloo Region Public Health to exercise physical distancing, City Hall is open for select services on an appointment basis only. City Council continues to meet remotely, and members of the public are invited to participate in this meeting electronically by accessing the meeting live stream video at kitchener.ca/watchnow. While in-person delegation requests are not feasible at this time, members of the public are invited to submit written comments or participate electronically in the meeting by contacting Jeff Bunn, Manager, Council and Committee Services, Deputy City Clerk at jeff.bunn, that's jeff.bunn at kitchener.ca. Delegates must would have had to register by 8 a.m. Today in order to participate electronically. Written comments, however, could be sent to diana.saunderson, that's diana.saunderson at kitchener.ca, and will be circulated prior to the meeting and will form part of the public record. We have two items on today's agenda. One is a discussion item and one is a status report. The first being the discussion item, which is our external audit planning report. And we have our representative here, Tom Mennel, who's our partner with KPMG that's responsible for the audit. So welcome, Mr. Mennel.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, Council and staff and members of the public who happen to be looking on today. I was wondering if it is possible to share the screen with respect to my report. Thank you very much. What you'll see, and you've received in advance of today's meeting, is our audit planning report for the audit of the financial statements of the city for the year ending December 31st, 2020. With me today on the call is Courtney Cheel, who's a senior manager responsible for the audit. You can move to the next page, please. Next. That's what we look like. Next page. This page provides an executive summary of what's included in our report, and we've included right up front is COVID-19, and COVID-19 is undoubtedly having an impact on the city's operations and has an impact on the city's financial reporting and hence on the audit of the city's financial statements. And we'll talk about a bit about how that does impact the audit. We perform what's called a group audit, so there are components within the consolidated statements of the city that we examine separately, and then those come together in terms of the audit of the full consolidated financial statements, and we'll identify those as well. We do focus our audit on those areas that we consider to be of the greatest risk, and the ones that we'll talk to you about are post-employment benefits, tangible capital assets, and obligatory reserve fund revenue and deferred revenue. We have calculated materiality of $7 million for this year's audit, and we'll talk again about how that's calculated. We do have extensive quality control processes in place that we have incorporated in our audit methodologies and in the way that we conduct our audits. And our goal is to provide complete transparency on the services that we provide and follow any protocols that the audit committee provides us with. Our proposed fees for the annual audit are $152,500 for all of the audit entities combined. There are some current developments and audit trends we'll talk about, and again, we'll discuss those later. We can move to the next page, please. Thank you. Now, with respect to COVID-19, there are a number of potential financial reporting implications. We haven't identified specifically any of these that relate to the city. However, in the course of our audit interim review, which will happen in November, and discussions with staff, if there are any of these that apply, we'll certainly talk about them and make sure that they're incorporated into the audit procedures that we perform. And they would be in things like impairment of non-financial assets such as tangible capital assets, the use of which may be affected by COVID. There may also be impairment of other assets, financial assets, for which the market values may be impacted, again, by COVID-19. Any other fair value measurements, employee benefits and employer obligations, which is an area that we focus on, whether there are any provisions, contingencies, or onerous contracts that need to be accounted for. Revenue cycle accounting may be affected, the contracts with your customers or your citizens, and any subsequent events that may happen after the end of the year that need to be reflected within the financial statements. So in our work on internal controls, we'll certainly look at whether there are any changes in internal controls, whether as a result of fraud risks or pressures on staff to present a certain result. We'll certainly take that into account. Sometimes there may be new or enhanced controls because of the new financial reporting risks relating to sort of COVID measures. Sometimes because of COVID, there have been changes in individuals performing controls. Segregation of duties is sometimes difficult to achieve when people are working remotely. Revisions may need to be made to some of the work that's done by internal audit, and reconsideration of internal control aspects related to just broader access to your systems given remote work arrangements. There also may be some disclosures. You'll note that in your financial statements for 2019, there were disclosures related to COVID-19, but no real impact directly on the numbers. And just any other things like cybersecurity, which are obviously of concern to us. Next page, please. And with respect to audit implications, and I guess one of the things that that we have done is we've actually done a virtual audit. So staff and the auditors have worked through the year-end audit for 2019 remotely because COVID had basically happened, or the impact of that was started just preceding our year-end audit last year. So we have been through an audit. We know that we can do it. We're not certain as to what the circumstances will be, particularly at the year end. It will be in person if possible, but clearly we're prepared to do it remotely if necessary. So we will take that into account with our audit. There may be some impacts on the metrics for determining materiality. Our materiality, as I'll get to, is based on revenue. And to the extent your revenues are impacted, and we don't understand that there will be a significant impact at this point that would have an impact on materiality in any event, but it could have an impact, and certainly we'll revisit that during the audit if necessary. We talked about remote auditing. Timing of procedures may need to change if test of controls, for example, may need to be deferred if they do change during the course of the work that we do. So during our interim review, which is coming up in November, we will look at these types of issues and determine the procedures that are necessary to address them. Next page, please. So we talked about the fact that this is a group audit and there are a number of entities that are included within the consolidated statements, and they're listed here. Included also is Kitchener Power Corporation, which KPMG audits, and its results and net assets are included within these financial statements on a one-line basis using the modified equity method, but nonetheless, we do rely on that audit for purposes of the audit of the city. Next page, please. In terms of risk, we do have a professional requirement to address the risk of materially misstatement due to fraud resulting from fraudulent revenue recognition. But we have rebutted this, which is allowable. It's consistent with what we've done in prior years. The presumed fraud risk is ordinarily associated with for-profit enterprises. The majority of revenue is calculated based on MPAC data, approved utility rates, and is not really subject to judgment at the reporting level. And KPMG does not believe that the use of inappropriate cutoff would be utilized to perpetrate fraud. So we do extensive work over revenue, but we haven't identified it as a fraud risk that we need to address. Next page, please. All audits are required to address the risk material misstatement to fraud resulting from management override, and we're not able to rebut this. This is the response to this fraud risk is embedded within our audit methodology, and we have the required procedures necessary to address that, including testing of journal entries, performing a retrospective review of estimates, and evaluating the rationale for significant or unusual transactions. Next page, please. We've also highlighted a risk relating to post-employment benefits, and these would be sort of your non-pension employment benefits. And the estimates and judgments used by management are what we focus on, or by the staff, and it is a complex area. So we do communicate with management's actuarial specialists and rely on them for purposes of the accounting for post-employment benefits. And we assess the reasonableness of the assumptions, we test the appropriateness of the data, and we also work with, as I mentioned, with the external actuary. Next page, please. Tangible capital assets are an area of focus because they certainly are very significant to the statement of financial position of the city. And the risk is a risk of error in inappropriately recognizing costs as either capital or operating. So we do review the capitalization policies and their application with staff. We test some capital additions, and we also ensure that items that are included in expense accounts, such as repairs and maintenance, are not capital in nature to ensure the completeness of the capital assets recorded. Next page, please. Another area of focus is obligatory reserve fund revenue and deferred revenue. And really this relates to the work that we do over the development charge reserve fund. And it is subject to judgment as to which capital projects would apply or be allowed to be accounted for in this manner. So we do test controls around the recording of revenue and cash receipts. We do some detailed testing over amounts being recognized as revenue by ensuring that the projects which they relate to are allocated to are appropriate and the related expenditures have been incurred. And also we do testing over the collection of development charges and that are recorded in the deferred revenue account, those amounts that have not yet been recorded as revenue. Next page, please. So we just listed here some other areas of focus. I won't go into detail on them, but they're consistent with those that we've addressed in prior years. So we do focus on a number of other areas that we consider to be not as high risk, but certainly ones that are significant enough to warrant our attention. This page shows the calculation of materiality. Materiality is based upon a benchmark of revenue, which is consistent with what we've used historically. The materiality this year has been calculated to be $7 million, which is consistent with what we used last year, and it's based on budgeted revenues for the year. If those amounts are significantly different, then we would go back and revisit the materiality used and perhaps adjust the extent of testing that we may perform in certain areas. And the percentage that this materiality is of the budgeted revenue is consistent in line with what we've used last year, as we consider the risk profile of the city to be similar. Next page, please. And on to audit quality and transparency. So here on a page, we've talked about audit quality, and certainly it is important that that you understand that we consider audit quality important, and these are some of the things that we've used in order to ensure that is the case. Next page. So this is one of the earliest times in my recollection that we presented to you our audit plan, but I think it's always good to start early, particularly in the circumstances we face today. So our audit planning was done in August. We're presenting to you in September. We will be doing our interim field work in November, and then our final field work in March and April of next year, with the plan that we would present to you in June of next year at a similar meeting to this. We certainly believe it's important to have ongoing communication with council or the audit committee and senior management throughout. So these are some milestones that we've set, but certainly if there are issues that arise that require discussion or being addressed outside of these meetings, then certainly we will do that as well. Next page. There are some new audit and accounting standards, and I'll go through these. With respect to the accounting standards, there are no new accounting standards that will impact the financial statements of the city this year. The city uses public sector accounting standards to account for its operations. We talked about employee benefits, and that there is a standard for employee benefits in public sector accounting. Hasn't changed for a long time. There are some changes that certainly have occurred with respect to pension plans and other forms of employee benefits over the last few years, and I think this is bringing the accounting standards up to date with regards to those. There is an exposure draft that's being developed currently with regards to it, but certainly it hasn't yet been issued. You may have heard of asset retirement obligations as a new standard that will have some impact on public sector entities. It's not effective until your December 31st, 2022 year end, but it does talk about how you would account for costs associated with remediating assets at their end of the useful life, so that those costs are accounted for over the useful life of the asset. So really the city has been working at this, understanding the standard and how it will impact the accounts of the city, and they are working at identifying whether there are any asset retirement obligations to account for. Public-private partnerships are more common all the time, so there is an accounting standard that has been developed, or a proposed one. It's in an exposure draft at this point. And also with respect to revenue, there is a new standard that will be effective for the 2023 year end. The standards currently address taxation and also government transfers as revenues of public sector entities. This will look at the other forms of revenue that a city may have. Next page, please. There is an auditing standard that does impact this year. It relates to how we audit estimates, and certainly it provides more specific guidance with regards to how we address the audit of estimates, and it's more granular. It provides more focus on levels of estimation uncertainty. There will be some additional work that will be required, although we're not certain how extensive that will be, and this will be something that we'll look at in our interim audit. Next page, please. Our proposed fees are disclosed here. They are consistent with the contract we have with you. We're in the second year of our contract, and the fees that are included here are those that were quoted to you. There are some appendices attached to our document. I won't go through these in detail, but certainly if you have questions relating to them, I'd be happy to answer them. And Mayor, that's our report. We'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee has. Barry, I think you're on mute. If I can.
I am. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Manel. We do have some questions for you. Councillor Chapman, you're first.
Yeah, thank you. My question has to do with the public-private partnership component of the audit. How do you ensure transparency and full disclosure when you're auditing? Like, is there client privilege that goes along?
Go ahead, Mr. Manel.
Well, thank you.
Along with the private sector?
So there is I made reference to public-private partnerships, and there are no specific audit standards now with respect to that. So that's why there is an exposure draft. There are some proposed standards with respect to public-private partnerships. Our approach generally would be that if we rely on other entities or other forms of accounting for a public-private partnership, then we would need to rely on either the auditors of that public-private partnership or determine that it's not material enough to warrant that, or do the work ourselves. But I'm not aware of any that we currently do with regards to the city of Kitchener. So certainly, I'd be happy to discuss that further if there are more details.
Is that it?
Okay, I just wonder about, where the, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering if there was a, where the line would be drawn. Because when the moment you bring in those, the private sector, there could be things that are privileged, right? That wouldn't be open to the public sector. Anyway, thank you for your comments.
Councillor Gazzola.
Having trouble unmuting. Just a couple of quick questions. On your, Tom, on your presentation, page 4, and on our city thing, it's 1-10. We list all the consolidated entities, and you specifically list the City of Kitchener Gas Works Enterprise. Where you obviously do a little additional work. Does that include also all the utilities, like the water and the sewer enterprise and the stormwater?
Yes, it does. We would include
Okay,
all of those utilities within the audit of the City of Kitchener.
Okay, so when it says City of Kitchener Gas Works Enterprise, it's really the utilities enterprise. Yeah. Just one quick question. It's been a while. I forget all of these things, but what is the relevance between the 7 million materiality and the benchmark revenues of 421 million?
Through you, Mayor, to Councillor Gazzola. There is a benchmark when you use revenues, which is the appropriate benchmark for most public center entities, that the amount would be between 0.5% and 3% of that benchmark, depending on, I guess, the risk associated with the entity. So we've determined, and I think consistent with other municipalities that we audit and others audit, that a benchmark around 2% would be consistent with what we believe to be what's appropriate for a municipality in the City of Kitchener specifically.
Okay. Broadly, what makes up the 421 million?
Those would be all of the
That's all
revenue.
Yeah, taxes as well as enterprise revenues.
Through you, Mayor, yes, that would be the case.
Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Gazzola. Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation, Tom. In the report, it's 1-22 on ours, but it's page, I guess, 16 in yours. The changes, some of the expected changes, there's a couple of bullet points there. I'm just curious on the first one, it says more emphasis on the need for exercising professional skepticism. I'm wondering if you can go into a little more detail on what exactly that means and how it might affect things.
Well, it would mean that we would have to, through you, Mayor, we would have to focus more on ensuring that management representations or staff representations are corroborated through other forms of evidence. That would be one way. So when looking at estimates, obviously there's a lot of judgment that's involved. So in order to determine that we have appropriately addressed the issue with professional skepticism, we would need to look to ensure that we have other forms of support for the amounts beyond that, which may just be provided to us. So I think it just means that we ask more questions and we look to other evidence to support management judgments or staff judgments.
Okay, that sounds great. And the second point on that as well, more granular risk assessment to address each of the components in an estimate. How does that relate then to the materiality? I understand the materiality actually catches things that are much lower than that threshold.
Well, I think that materiality would come into play when assessing whether or not a change in one of those items would affect the outcome of the result materially. So that's a judgment that an auditor would make. So for example, if changes in the data that's been used or the appropriateness of the data may have an impact on the calculation of an estimate. And we'd have to say, does that change in data, would a change in that data have a material effect on whether or not the estimate is appropriately recorded? So there's a lot of judgment, but we have to be more, I guess, specific with respect to each of those items, method, data, assumptions in the audit of an estimate.
Okay, sounds like a bit more work for you guys, but I appreciate it. I'll move the item, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davey. Is there any other questions? There don't appear to be. So all those in favor? Any opposed? John, is that opposed or in favor?
It's just slow movement of the
Oh,
hand.
okay. Thank you. That's carried then. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Manel, and
Thank you.
stay well and stay healthy.
Likewise. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Okay, and now we'll move on to item number 2, which is the third quarter audit status report, and we'll turn over to Ms. Tasker. Welcome, Karina.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just give a moment there for the presentation to get back up on the screen. There we go. If you could just advance to the summary screen, that would be great. Perfect, thanks. All right, so in today's audit status report, I'm going to be sharing the overtime and on-call pay audit results. And then also in progress at this time, well, actually at the time of writing the report, I was also still involved in the development services review for implementing process improvements to the site plan and public engagement processes. I've since wrapped up my involvement in that project. However, Margaret Love and the development staff continue to work on the next wave of improvements for that review. I've also started a physical inventory of our computer hardware stock on hand. And as part of that review, I'll also be working with staff to develop an audit plan for computer assets that are in the field, which will be done once staff return to the office environment. And the purpose of that portion of it will be to verify the location of all assets that are currently deployed to staff and ensure that all assets that were taken home during the pandemic get returned to the office. And the final item in progress at this time is a series of controls audits, which I mentioned at the June Audit Committee meeting, that are in response to new processes being implemented during the pandemic, which I'll tell you a little bit about on the next slide. So as you know, we had to adapt our processes very quickly at the start of the pandemic in order to offer our services in a different way. So I've gathered a list of all of the processes which have changed during this time and selected those which potentially have changes to controls and safeguarding of assets. Over the next few months, I will be finding out more about each of the process changes and determining whether controls have also changed and whether testing is required. The majority of the areas for change revolve around processes which went from in-person or paper transactions to online versions. Things such as online approvals and electronic signatures, the protection of information collected online, and the protection of other online data and financial transactions will be reviewed. I'll also be looking at how we are monitoring and enforcing new safety protocols. So I plan to report back on these hopefully at the December Audit Committee meeting, and if not, then hopefully at the March one. So are there any questions on this before I move on to the overtime audit?
Sorry, I'm just in attendees. There are no questions.
All right, so next slide, please. All right, so the overtime and on-call pay audit. So the objective of this had two facets to it. First, I wanted to make sure that staff are being compensated for their work outside of their normal working hours in a fair and consistent manner. And the flip side of this is that I also wanted to make sure that staff weren't taking advantage or circumventing policies or collective agreements in order to get paid more. For this review, I started by reading the applicable corporate policies, legislation, and the language in the collective agreements to get an understanding of how time should be captured and paid. Next, I interviewed and surveyed a sample of staff and management from across the corporation to find out what was actually happening, including the processes, the systems, and the interpretations of the rules that were being used. And finally, I conducted an extensive testing of overtime and on-call paid data, which I'll take you through in a moment. Next slide. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to go over a few of the basic definitions, just so that we're all clear about what I'm talking about. First is earned overtime, which is any hours that an employee works beyond their normal workday or work week. And the definition of a normal workday or week is set out in the various collective agreements and may vary between different employee groups. Once an employee has earned overtime, it could be paid to them in one of two ways. First, it can be paid on their paycheck at a rate usually 1.5 or 2 times their hourly rate, depending on which union that they belong to. Or they can save the time earned as lieu time, where they just take the time off at a future date. And this too would be at 1.5 or 2 times their hours worked. The pink box on the screen shows something that is often called flex time and confused with the true lieu time. It's called the Modified Time Program, which is a formal program that allows salaried employees, with their supervisor's approval, of course, to work an extra half hour per day on a regular basis and bank or save the time to be used later. This is different than overtime and is accumulated only at straight time. The final definition is on-call pay, and staff who are required to be available to respond to emergencies after hours or on weekends will be paid a set amount for being available, whether they get called out or not. On-call responsibilities typically rotate among staff so that the employee would only get paid this amount while they're officially on call. Next slide. The testing that I did for this audit included a number of standard tests related to typical fraud schemes, as well as some specific tests that were requested by management. And that's not that management suspected that there was fraud, but rather that they were uncertain of what was happening in certain areas, and they just wanted me to look into it a little bit in more detail. So I am happy to report that I didn't find any fraud in the tests that I performed. I did, however, make several recommendations where policies, processes, and management oversight could be improved. So there were 4 tests that I had no concerns with and therefore no recommendations. And they included, first, looking at the correlation between overtime and sick time. In a neighboring municipality, they had a whistleblower tip that staff were calling in sick so that their coworker could log the overtime and then return the favor the next week. While I did scour through a ton of data looking for these relationships, it's a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. So while I didn't find anything unusual in the data, in the absence of a specific tip, I'm not confident that I would find evidence of fraud. The second test was to see if any management grade 11 or above had claimed overtime in contravention to policy. There was only one isolated incidence of a management staff who was actually in an acting role claiming overtime on one occasion when they shouldn't have. The amount was less than $100, and I'm not concerned about this. One of the specific tests I was asked to do included checking that roads and traffic records to make sure that staff who normally work a weekend shift are using the shift premium rather than claiming overtime, which is what I found. And another specific test was to determine if engineering overtime was supported with legitimate business needs, which was also found to be true. Next slide. The remaining 4 tests did uncover areas for improvement. First is the correlation between vacation liability and overtime. Having large unused vacation balances can indicate that an employee doesn't want to leave their post because they are doing something fraudulent that they don't want someone who's backfilling them to uncover. However, it can also simply mean that there's too much work and staff don't have time to take vacation. So I started by looking at cases where staff had large amounts of vacation balances and overtime claims. What I found initially was that there were many cases where staff were carrying over more vacation than is allowed by policy, which is either 1 or 2 weeks maximum over the vacation year end. On further investigation into the reasons for the high vacation balances, I found that many were related to leaves, such as sick leaves or parental leaves. While on leave, vacation entitlement continues to accrue. So when staff return to the office, they don't have time to take all of this added vacation and they end up carrying a lot over. So during the pandemic, management made the decision to force all staff to use their vacation up in order to decrease our vacation liability. While most of the staff on my original list have now reduced their balances, there are many new staff on the list because they were granted an exemption since they were working on critical or supporting the Emergency Operations Center. In order to maintain vacation balances within policy, I've made 2 recommendations related to changing the policies. First, I'm recommending that the policy related to parental leaves be amended to include not only the option of tacking the vacation onto the end of the leave, but also the option of being paid out instead if the employee wishes, and that no carryovers would be allowed. So you're either getting paid out or you're using it at the end of your leave. The second policy change is that when staff transition from sick leave to a long-term disability, that their vacation is paid out at that time rather than carrying the liability for an undetermined time period. And finally, I recommend that I work with HR to develop a more robust process for management to monitor vacation balances and provide some accountability for ensuring that their staff are using their vacation in a timely manner. Next slide. The next test related to the use of premium codes. Premium codes are used to pay staff more than their hourly rate in recognition of special circumstances or duties that they're performing. During my test, I found 2 issues. First, there were instances where there were new circumstances for which no premium code existed. So instead, staff were using existing premium codes in order to get paid. This can have pension and tax implications. So therefore, a new code has been set up for the specific situation that was found. The second issue was that it was not evident to me when I looked at the work order data whether the criteria for using certain premium codes was being met. At first, I thought that they had used the codes in error, but then it was explained to me that the data related to the use of particular premium codes could be spread across multiple work orders, which is difficult to audit and trace. So for these situations, I'm recommending that a communication be sent to management from HR and payroll to remind them of when to use premium codes, and that it is their responsibility to verify that the criteria to use them is met prior to signing off on the payroll records. Next slide. Next is lieu time balances. So each collective agreement specifies the maximum amount of lieu time that an employee can bank at any one time. Not all staff track their lieu time in PeopleSoft, but for those that do, I found that 10% had balances that were greater than the allowable maximum for their particular collective agreement. I sent the list of staff to their directors and requested that they make a plan with the employees to draw down the balances within the collective agreement limits. Next slide. The final test that I performed was to identify any areas or staff with excessive overtime for further investigation. Through this test, I found that the position of network specialist in the Technology and Innovation Services Division had a large amount of overtime on an ongoing basis. This was spread across 4 staff who hold this position. Since it was out of scope to delve into the details, I'm recommending that management review the position in order to try to decrease the amount of overtime worked. This could include determining if efficiencies could be gained by making process improvements and/or whether certain tasks could be moved to other positions to reduce the workload. As a last resort, it could also involve a recommendation to add part-time staff. Next slide. So the next few slides talk about other general issues that were uncovered through the interviews, surveys, and my own observations. So the first is related to overall administration of attendance data. I found that there's no corporate-wide consistent system to track attendance. So we do have, of course, the PeopleSoft system, which is where our paychecks are generated from. However, there are multiple subsystems or source systems where the data is input first before it flows into PeopleSoft. These include purpose-specific systems such as CityWorks for tracking labor and material, or Telestaff, which is used in fire, which assists in shift management. There is also an in-house time tool application used by some divisions for salaried staff. And many divisions also track the data in Excel spreadsheets or on an honor system prior to inputting to PeopleSoft. Because there are so many source systems and methods of tracking, it becomes very difficult to monitor and audit the data. So I also found that there's inconsistent management approval processes. So some approve online through the source system prior to the time being worked. Others approve after the fact, verbally or in emails. And some get their admin staff to approve them as they enter them into PeopleSoft. So this means that there's an inconsistent level of management oversight across divisions. And finally, I found that there are discrepancies between some of the source systems and PeopleSoft, which is our official record. Sometimes the differences are simply related to timing, where the divisions only transfer their source system data to PeopleSoft at infrequent intervals. In other cases, there are unknown reasons why the data is different. Regardless of the cause, however, this presents a risk for the corporation. If an employee were to leave or be terminated, they can claim that they are owed what is listed on their PeopleSoft pay stub, for example, for their vacation balance, even if the source system shows that a much lower balance. Next slide. So in order to address these findings, I'm recommending a few different short and long-term solutions. First, I think it's important that senior management determine a consistent policy, process, and management approval mechanism for all overtime and lieu time, regardless of what source system a division uses. So this will help provide consistent oversight and improve controls. Next, staff should continue their investigation into why there are discrepancies between systems and work to eliminate those in the short term. So this work is ongoing already and it should continue. Also in the short term, while that work is underway, I think it's important that a policy is created to document the current authoritative source. For example, if there is a discrepancy between CityWorks and PeopleSoft, when an employee leaves, CityWorks would be deemed the authoritative source with the most up-to-date data. In the long term, I'm recommending that we look for a better solution, which could mean either better integration between our existing systems coupled with more frequent uploads to PeopleSoft, or as systems are upgraded, it could mean looking for another system that meets all of our needs in one system. Now, just recently, I know that Council approved the purchase of software to use with CityWorks, and I'm told that this software has the potential to meet our needs in other divisions as well. So it should be considered as part of the research related to this recommendation. Next slide. The next topic relates to management education. Through the interviews and surveys, several management staff indicated that they'd like more information on attendance management in order to ensure that they are doing things correctly. So I've listed some of the topics that they're interested in on the screen, but in particular, they want to look out for what are the red flags to look out for when they're doing their attendance management. In order to address these requests, I'm recommending that HR put together an online training module and reference materials that management can take at their own pace when needed. Next slide. The next topic was a hot topic and many felt passionately about this one. There's currently a policy which states that management staff grade 11 and above are not eligible for overtime, lieu time pay. However, there was great dissatisfaction by several management staff where they felt that they are expected to work a great deal of overtime without being compensated. While there are some management staff who do work overtime in order to keep on top of workload and they do it at their own request, there are some positions which are required to work to support critical operations outside of business hours. Although not required under the ESA legislation, benchmarking with other municipalities found that some cities do compensate their management staff for required overtime and on-call pay in some manner or another. So as part of this audit, I facilitated a discussion with the corporate leadership team about the high degree of dissatisfaction with the policy and whether they felt that there was merit in exploring options to provide compensation to management for overtime and on-call duties. During the initial discussion, CLT agreed that some sort of compensation was likely warranted, but they were unsure what form it would take and who it should apply to. Next slide. As a result, my recommendation follows their request to gather more information before making a decision. As such, GMs will gather data from all of their supervisors, managers, and directors regarding their overtime and on-call responsibilities to help determine which ones are truly required as a business need versus those that are working the time because they want to or feel they need to. CLT will then reconvene to review the data and come to a consensus on a recommendation. And I don't know what that will be yet, so we won't discuss it here today. However, once they do have a path forward, as with all compensation decisions, they will bring their recommendation to council for approval if a change to the existing policy is being put forward. Next slide. The final topic is related to being on call. If someone is being paid to be on call, be available to respond in a timely manner, not be impaired or otherwise unable to respond. This is, of course, stressful for staff and inconvenient for them as they must remain in the city. However, it is necessary in order to support our city operations. Normally, the responsibility to be on call is rotated within a work group so that the same position isn't on call all of the time. However, I found that there were some positions that are on call all the time, 365 days a year, which is an unreasonable expectation to put on staff. Next slide. My recommendation is to develop on-call rotations among more staff and provide cross-training on critical tasks to facilitate this in a few key areas. First, there are 2 specialized positions in the Technology and Innovation Services divisions who are on call all of the time. Second, some community center supervisors feel that they must be on call weekends and after hours when the centers are open in order to support their frontline staff and deal with any issues that arise. And third, through the research that the GMs will be doing with their management staff, there may be other areas that are uncovered which would benefit from an on-call rotation. And another piece of this is to explicitly communicate the expectations to be on call for those where it is applicable versus just being available on best efforts via phone or email. So this will help to manage expectations with all staff, whether they are officially to be on call or not. Next slide. So that concludes my summary of this audit. Just to reiterate, I did not find any fraud, but did put forward several recommendations for changes to policy, processes, and oversight. All of the recommendations have been shared with both CLT and the relevant directors who are responsible for implementing them. And I will follow up around the 1 year from now to check in on the status of the recommendations. Are there any questions?
Great, thanks for a very thorough presentation, Ms. Tasker. We have several councillors with questions. First one's Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor. Karina, thank you for another great, thorough report. With the on-call rotation, it's a little alarming to me that there's only 2 people that can do the on-call service for those 2 specialist positions. And you mentioned there's reluctance on the part of others to cross-train for this. Was there any indication why there was the reluctance to be cross-trained?
I think it's because it's a very specialized field that is very detailed. So I don't think it's impossible to do. I think it just requires determining what are the critical tasks that need to be done and making sure that those are documented and that someone is trained on them.
Do you have any idea how long it might take to train people to spell some of these people off who are on call 365 days a year? To me, that's a real big ask of a lot of these 2 people.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long it would take to train them.
Okay, I just would love to see that as quickly as possible because that's a huge responsibility. Thank you.
Ms. Rob, can you offer any insight onto that, or Mr. Chapman?
Yeah, I can, through you, Mayor Verbanovic. The 2 positions are very niche positions. One is our telephone analyst, and then the other one is a network person. Part of it is the cross training, and part of it is these are 2 very dedicated employees who are so committed that they really have not pushed to have other people be cross-trained with them. I'll put it that way. They really see it as their obligation and their commitment to the organization. And so it's really just about giving them the permission to feel like it's okay to not be on call 24/7, 365, and that they understand that it's really more about a business continuity risk. It's not that we don't trust them to do a great job, but that there are others who can backfill them so they can go on vacation and not be tethered to their phone.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else, Councillor Schneider? No. Councillor Marsh.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic. So, Ms. Tasker, I was just wondering about whether or not in your work you were able to look at some of the unique challenges that we have now based on so many people working from home and being able to track their time properly, and then for their managers to also be able to, make sure that they're managing their employees' time, or not managing, but tracking it as well.
This audit was actually more or less concluded before we really got into working through the pandemic, but I do know from my own experience that through the use of some of the workforce tracking in Teams, that employees are being asked to record what they are planning to do in the next week and whether things get accomplished or not, so that management has a good handle on productivity and what is being accomplished.
Okay, so we are focused more on goal setting week to week rather than on working at specific time periods during the day. Is that what I'm to understand?
No, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily true. I think it depends on the position. Certainly transactional type positions, they have their set work that they're doing and it's during certain business hours. Other positions may be different.
I guess I don't need a full answer. I guess what I want to do though is, given that we are looking ahead to at least another several months, if not longer, with this pandemic way of working from home, I'd love to make sure that we have good processes in place for our staff to be able to track their time management and their goals efficiently. That's all. But I see Mr. Chapman has chimed in, wants to chime in maybe.
Mr. Chapman, you want to add something?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, just to say that we've been building this airplane mid-flight. As you know, the pandemic and the closure came upon us fairly quickly. What I can assure council is that as we move into the next phase, this September through December timeframe, we're working very hard to set very clear expectations for staff that are working from home. And that includes things like the expectation that they be at their workstation during the regular hours of work, that they be available to answer their phone at their regular extension through technology during normal hours of work. And so we're setting clear expectations around what's required of staff. And on top of that, as Ms. Rabb has indicated, are going even further through Microsoft planning tools within Microsoft Teams to require staff that are working from home to develop a plan with their supervisor for the upcoming week and then to report back on status. And so while we can't be there to directly observe, I'm satisfied that there are clear expectations and good processes in place to ensure that staff are accountable for their time.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Ioannidis.
Thanks, Mayor Urbanovic, and thanks, Ms. Tasker, for your report. Always thorough as usual. I guess my question is, and it's maybe not even really a question, I'm just wondering, when you go through your review for the grade 11 management position, can you put in all the position titles that includes, so we can get a better understanding of which positions are the ones that are using the overtime?
Sure. There was only one, as I said, that was found that was grade 11 or above, and it was a position that was someone that was normally a supervisor that was in an acting management role. So they would normally be allowed to have overtime. They shouldn't have claimed it when they were in their acting role.
Okay, so it was just that one instance.
Just one, yeah.
Oh, okay, then no worries. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Thanks for the work in the presentation, Ms. Tasker. Just a couple questions. First, I just wanted to get some clarification on one of the recommendations was to limit liability, was to pay out staff that have accumulated significant vacation time. And I'm just not understanding. To me, that's just realizing the liability instead of getting rid of the liability. So how does that actually help us liability wise?
People are paid out at their current rate of pay. So if you've got vacation that has been lingering for many years, as some of these have been, you're paying them out at a higher rate than what it was earned at.
Okay, that helps. Okay, that helps. The other concern I have, I guess going forward, this is more in a general sense, I'm not sure if this is for you to answer, Ms. Tasker, or perhaps Mr. Chapman, but as I was going through the audit, to be frank, I was concerned, like most of the recommendations either include implementing new systems, hiring more staff, and in some cases increasing compensation for staff. And this seems to be a worrisome trend, especially now. Like I'm not, this is probably the worst possible time to see suggestions about compensating grade 11 and above. And I understand that it's only one member of staff, but my fear is we implement a policy that could obviously be extended to other staff. So I would just like to get the response on how we can possibly get recommendations coming back that are more within our existing financial envelope.
Mr. Chapman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I would start by saying I was very gratified to see the fundamental finding of this audit, which is that there has not been fraud perpetrated around overtime and use of time. And so I think that is a very strong starting point. We accept the auditor's recommendation that greater consistency around approval of time is desirable. I share your view, Councillor Davey, that I'm not interested in committing hundreds of hours of staff time and millions of dollars of budget to implement systems for the sake of systems. I do believe that there are improvements that can be made in this area without spending exorbitant sums of money, and greater consistency is desirable, and so we accept that finding. On the issue of management over time, there is no recommendation from senior management here. My view is that there are some, especially frontline supervisors, that are expected to be on call essentially and work overtime with no recognition for that. The area that I'm interested in exploring most significantly is the potential for on-call rotations. And so those are fairly low-cost scenarios that recognize the accountability that a manager would have or a supervisor to be available, to be responding, to be dealing, as an example, with all of our community centers after hours. And given the extended hours that they operate under, that may be a reasonable expectation. And so I highlight that as one example of where there may be very specific recommendations coming back. But I share your view that now is not the time to increase costs substantially. And I can commit today that that will not be the outcome of our review of these recommendations.
That provides you significant comfort. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Davey. Councillor Johnson.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the report, Ms. Tasker. I've worked from home myself for 8 years. I work at the university and I work from home. And all across our particular division, we find that we have flexibility to be able to do things throughout the day, but we probably end up working more hours, I think, or actually more hours where we're able to get consistent work done, maybe than in other roles in the university. So I think I appreciate that we're not going to be putting kind of a lot of more money and effort into finding if there's some people here who aren't doing that. I'm going to assume that some people will do that, but the majority of people are actually doing what we're expecting them to be doing, and under brand new circumstances and an odd environment. Many of them now have kids at home, et cetera. So it's been a little different. So I'm hoping that we'll look at this and think that most people do err on the side of being honest and are doing the right thing.
Great, thanks, Councillor Johnson. So that appears to be all of the questions, and there's no recommendation here. So just thank you, Karina, to you and your team for a job well done once again.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful.
Team of one.
But you rely on others to help you with information and so on. But yes, you are a strong team of one. There's no question about that. Wonderful. Thank you. I'll take a motion to adjourn, but I'm going to ask people to stay on because we're going to go right into special counsel on this call to go into to move the motion to go into caucus. So motion to adjourn, moved by Councillor Johnson. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And so, Mr. Bunn, I can go straight into the special council meeting?
That's right.
Okay, so I'll call the special council meeting to order. There are 2 items that are on the current agenda, and there's one solicitor-client privilege item that staff have advised will be adding on to the agenda. So I will first of all need to waive notice to add that solicitor-client item, moved by Councillor Galloway-Seelock, seconded by Councillor Marsh. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Motion to go into caucus for the 3 items. Councillor Ioannidis, seconded Councillor Singh. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And motion to adjourn, Councillor Davey and Councillor Schneider. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. So